With just 11 days to go until Election Day, President Trump and Joe Biden are back on the campaign trail following the final presidential debate. The candidates were questioned on a wide range of topics, from the economy to immigration and more. This debate had much more policy talk and far fewer interruptions than the last. The first topic of the night was the coronavirus, where Joe Biden slammed the Trump administration for its response.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
But President Trump said a vaccine is coming in weeks and defended his administration's response to the pandemic.
2.2 million people modeled out were expected to die. We closed up the greatest economy in the world in order to fight this horrible disease that came from China. It's a worldwide pandemic. It's all over the world. You see the spikes in Europe and many other places right now. If you notice, the mortality rate is down 85%. The excess mortality rate is way down and much lower than almost any other country.
For more on this, I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you both. Leslie, let me start with you. Polling shows that President Trump is trailing behind Joe Biden. But did the president do what he needed to do last night to change that trajectory?
The president was effective. That is really going to be determined. How effective? Is it enough to get him across the finish line in some of those battleground states? It's going to be really close. And the reason I say that, this isn't about just putting points on the board. It's about some key areas. The president looked calm, measured, looked presidential, and he looked like he wanted the job. He was really fighting for it. And you contrast that against Biden, who was a much darker candidate, and looking at his watch, he looked not only defensive, vague, but also somebody who wasn't as excited and kind of coasting to the finish line. That's just stylistic, but there were some major gaps on the issues of oil and gas, what Biden wants to do in terms of a rapid reduction, it sounds like, of fossil fuels, his issues on immigration, kind of the open borders concept. So some of those really landed in terms of Trump's ability to crystallize that around states that are going to matter, Texas, Pennsylvania, and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I do expect that gap to close.
Joel, what do you think? Do you want to respond to what Leslie just said about whether the Trump administration or the Trump campaign was ever able to pull some sound bites from the debate that will help it? Or, do you think that Joe Biden did what he needed to do to maintain his apparent lead in the polls?
Well, probably the most interesting takeaway from me, Tanya, was the fact that rule, that muting the microphones rule, that actually, I think, helped Donald Trump. And I think his campaign probably is sitting there kind of smacking their head saying, if he would have just listened to us the first time, maybe he wouldn't have dug himself such a big hole in that first debate 2 weeks ago. I think both candidates performed better. I think what Trump needed was to perform better and for Biden to be bad. I don't think Biden was bad. I thought Biden was good and passed the test. And I thought both candidates were able to land rhetorical punches that are going to help them down the stretch. I think nothing changed in terms of the trajectory of the race. I do think that there are some things that both candidates need to clean up, like Donald Trump cheering on young children in cages, and yes, Joe Biden needing to clarify his answers around fracking and climate change and things of that nature. So it's a typical debate. I think we've been so warped to expect kind of a fire show at these debates that seeing kind of a typical, normal, pedestrian debate probably shocks our senses at this point.
And, Joel, just to follow up, the president has repeatedly attacked Joe Biden on these unverified claims about his family and overseas business dealings. Do you think that's an effective tact, for the president to be taking? And how do you think Biden is handling those attacks?
Well, I don't think it's effective. And look, you can take me off the board as a, kind of a biased Democrat, but I also don't think the electorate thinks it's effective. This isn't the first time we've heard these attacks. I mean, the president and his team have been kind of going to work on Joe Biden and by extension Hunter Biden for going on 18 months now, and nothing has landed. I mean, Joe Biden's been pretty Teflon on that issue. I also think Biden did a good job of dispatching concerns about his son in the last debate, where he acknowledged his son's problems with substance abuse and really kind of disabused the president of any ability to use that as a political tool. So I don't think that the Hunter Biden piece works. Hunter Biden's not on the ballot. His father is. And I think what Joe Biden has done throughout has demonstrated himself to be a loving father who has a son that's having some difficulties in his life, but is somebody who has performed ethically the way you would expect a former vice president to perform and a public official to perform.
Leslie, I want to turn to you now and talk about climate change, which was one of the topics last night. At one point, the president pushed Biden on his plans for energy and the environment. So let's listen to that part.
Would you close down the oil industry?
By the way, I would transition from the oil industry, yes.
Oh,
I would
that's
transition.
a big statement.
It is a big statement.
That's a
because
big statement.
I would stop.
Why would you do that?
Because the oil industry pollutes significantly.
I see.
And here's the deal. But
That's
you
a
can't
big
do
statement.
that. Well, if you let me finish the statement, because it has to be replaced by renewable energy over time.
So, of course, Biden later clarified his comments, saying it's not his plan to get rid of fossil fuels, but to get rid of subsidies. The Trump campaign called Biden's initial comments a grave error. So, Leslie, could this comment haunt the Biden campaign?
I will tell you anecdotally, last night there were a lot of emails and kind of from different campaigns, strategic states that were saying, there goes Pennsylvania. That key type of gap or misunderstanding or recontextualizing whatever he wants to say about fossil fuels and fracking is not going to really work with voters who depend on the energy industry. That is why it's so paramount that the president continues to kind of get clarification and put pressure Biden in that space. That really meant a lot. That was probably one of the most powerful, if not jaw-dropping moments. And it's very small, but it matters in states like Pennsylvania. It matters in states like Texas. It matters for people that depend on their livelihood. And I'm a Texan from Houston. I mean, this is our bread and butter in terms of understanding the energy industry. And and Trump said it. He said, there goes the industry. There's a balance that needs to happen between industry and certainly climate and the accountability. But that type of kind of blanket response is what people have feared that the left and progressives would do in terms of attacking the industry as a whole. That's why that particular exchange is so meaningful in this debate.
Okay. And Joel, I want to talk now about race, because the president said last night he was, quote, the least racist person in the room, and that he's done more for the black community than any other president except maybe Abraham Lincoln. What did you make of those comments, and what do you think, African-American voters will make of them?
Well, that was some really kind modesty to say maybe Abraham Lincoln. I also think Lyndon Johnson might want to have a word in this conversation as well. I think the president was clumsy around race like he always is. We shouldn't be surprised at this point. And, what stood out to me was particularly on that question that Kristen Welker asked about the talk that black families have to have with their sons and daughters about how to handle police interactions. Joe Biden demonstrated such an understanding of what that is in terms of, what you have to deal with as a black parent. And Donald Trump acted as if he was an alien to that type of an experience. Donald Trump tends to talk in terms of transaction. I did this for you. I got HBCU's money. I was able to pass the First Step Act, et cetera. Those things are important, and it's helpful to have policy that supports communities. But it's also helpful to show dignity and respect and equality. And the president doesn't practice those values. And Joe Biden dominated him in that section of the debate because he reflected what African American communities expect in terms of moral leadership from their president.
All right, guys, we have just 11 days left until the election. More than 50 million Americans have already voted. So I want to hear from both of you. What do you think the candidates need to do in this final stretch to sway those very limited undeciders, or, to get people who weren't excited about voting to get out and vote? So Leslie, let's start with you.
That's the big key right there, Tanya, is getting people excited to go out and vote. It's like finding a unicorn to find these undecided voters. There's not that many anymore. These people have made up their mind. But the question is, do they think the president deserves the second chance to carry that through? One thing that happened and the president did well, he finally started defending his response on the pandemic. I'm not taking an opinion on that. People have their own views on that. But he's putting a position where he's showing a contrast that I'm doing something versus talking. This still kind of outsider kind of aura, this reformer from the outside. He's not a traditional politician like Joe Biden, in the sense you've had all this time, you're all talk, but no action. And I think Joe brought up a great point. He doesn't have the empathy. It's very pedestrian. It's very unorthodox. It's very, you want to just put your fingers in, your hands and fist in the air. But is it effective? And to some extent, his style is effective. So continuing to move forward, be in the swing states, and get his base to finally turn out.
Okay, Joel, what about you?
I think about 3 words: enthusiasm, organization, and down ballot. With enthusiasm, Joe Biden needs to make sure that Democrats are on edge and ready to turn out those who haven't already voted early. You pointed out those record numbers that we've seen in states like Georgia, Texas, nationally. Organization, making sure your paid media programs reflect logistics of where to vote, when to vote, how to make a plan to vote. All of those things are really important down the stretch. And then down ballot. Both of these candidates, if they win, would like to have a Senate and a House that is aligned with them. For Joe Biden, part of his governing strategy will be to have places like Georgia and Texas and Kansas and all of these other states, Maine, Colorado, et cetera, where there are competitive Senate races, to have representation by Democrats there. So Joe Biden and his team, maybe he won't be there in the form of himself or a surrogate, but making sure that your presence is felt on the ground in those places, that's key to getting things over the finish line down the stretch.
All right, Joel Payne and Leslie Sanchez, thanks to both of you. We are fully in countdown mode. Thanks again.